Ellen White, Reconsidered, a series of presentations for people with questions about Ellen White's writings. Today's episode is entitled, How the Desire of Ages Was Produced. Welcome to another episode. We're glad that you could join us today. As I promised in our last one, we're going to talk about how the desire of ages was produced. I imagine, like a lot of people, I had the notion that Ellen White wrote The Desire of Ages in her Sunnyside home in Cornbong, New South Wales. You can see her pictured here. Sitting at her little lapboard over on the side, you can see that picture from later, and that she would just pick up from page one, start writing about the incarnation of Christ and his birth, and then just move on down through the different stories of his life until she came to the crucifixion, the resurrection, and then the ascension. And that's kind of how I pictured her writing it. Actually, The Desire of Ages is the best of Ellen White's writing on the life of Christ folded into a single account. We learned something about how that it was put together from an account written by one of the literary assistants who helped Marion Davis. Marion Davis was the one who brought it together. And as she presented it, she would read from a stack of pages of different sizes that she had gathered together and put in their order, and she would read them and he would type them out. So where did all of those pages come from that she had in her stack? Well, they came from various sources, and we discovered that Ellen White had been writing on the life of Christ for some time. You will recall the story of how she was hit with a rock by an angry schoolmate and then was unconscious for quite some time, had a long recovery, and remained sickly for many years after that, and how that experience was actually a catalyst for her to seek something higher because of her disappointment with friends and her academic aspirations. So she sought the Lord, and she came to know him at a meeting, and she described how she felt as a result of that experience. She said, "For 6 months, not a shadow clouded my mind, nor did I neglect one known duty. My whole endeavor was to do the will of God and keep Jesus and heaven continually in my mind. I was surprised and enraptured with the clear views now presented to my mind of the atonement and the work of Jesus Christ. There was not a cloud to mar my perfect bliss. I longed to tell the story of Jesus' love." With her 1858 Great Controversy vision, she began to write on the story of Jesus' love as a great drama in her book, The Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1. And she wrote several pages, first on the plan of redemption, and then about 50-some pages on the first advent of Christ. She began with these words, "Then I was carried down to the time when Jesus was to take upon himself man's nature, humble himself as a man, and suffer the temptations of Satan." Then very briefly and very simply, she wrote about Jesus' experience, his baptism, and his crucifixion. Wrote that out and included it in this, her first book, which was also carried over into early writings when it was republished in 1882. Her next writing on the life of Christ would be a chapter in the fourth volume of Spiritual Gifts entitled The Messiah. And she would describe what it was like for him to come from heaven down to earth, how he took on the form of humanity. And when his ministry commenced, he was but little taller than the common size of men then living upon the earth. Had he come among men with his noble heavenly form, his outward appearance would have attracted the minds of the people to himself, and he would have been received without the exercise of faith. Then she goes into the reasoning of the Jews at the time and how that they were anticipating a different kind of Messiah. And this is the beginning of what she would describe later on when she would write about the incarnation in Desire of Ages. Her next exposition on the life of Christ was a pamphlet of just a few pages that she published in 1869, and it was entitled The Sufferings of Christ. That first pamphlet would be reproduced and adapted in a number of ways over the years. Here we have a comparison. This program can give you an idea. Notice here on this side is the pamphlet, and here is the testimony. And you can see that there are some additional paragraphs that weren't in the pamphlet, applying it, but virtually the same. Then through the years, she would adapt it again. 1875, a series of articles for the Signs of the Times. Again, you can see that she added a whole lot more to it that time. The comparison software shows that she used it also in a number of articles, but one of the significant places she used it was in preparation of some pamphlets that were concomitant with these two volumes, but this is volume 2 and 3 of Spirit of Prophecy. And some of that material came into these volumes, as well as ultimately into the Desire of Ages. Now, there's something unique about these volumes as she began to write here. By this time, her husband had had a number of strokes, and he was no longer able to help her to proofread her writing, copy editing it for punctuation and spelling and proper grammar. And so she felt like she would have to give up her writing, but then she received the blessing of being able to work with her sister's daughter, who came and worked with her, and she wrote about some of the writing that she was doing. And let me share with you a letter that she wrote to her husband, who was not there at the time. Dear husband, Mary has just been reading to me 2 articles, one on the loaves and fishes, Christ walking on the water, and states to his hearers he has the bread of life, which caused some of his disciples to turn from him. This takes 50 pages and comprises many subjects. I do think it the most precious matter I have ever written. Mary is just enthusiastic over it. She thinks it is of the highest value. It was in these 2 volumes that, for the first time, Ellen White began to use storyline guides. As we pointed out in an earlier episode, when she was writing on Facts of Faith, she was not purporting to just report her visions, but that she was taking the stories through the Bible, the facts of faith, and giving lessons. And she said, I hope that these are a blessing to people. So these were the central volumes in the Spirit of Prophecy. If we look at the entire set, we discover that the first was published in 1870, these 2 in the center, 1877 and 1878, and volume 4, which is the equivalent of the Great Controversy, was published in 1884. Now, interestingly, she began to revise the same set in 1888 with the Great Controversy. This was an expansion. So 1888, and then she doubled back and revised the first volume, 1890. Now, what was missing? There was a life of Christ that was missing. And so she determined in 1891, when she was in Australia, to begin writing on the life of Christ. Well, that first year was a wash because she was not very well. Her arthritis was giving her terrible problems. So it wasn't really until the next year, 1892, that she began writing, and then she wrote about it this way. I write some every day on the life of Christ. One chapter sets my mind fresh upon other subjects. so that I had several scratch books that I'm writing upon. So she described the process, and here we're going to take a look at her own words, her own description of how the process was done. I feel very thankful for the help of Sister Marion Davis in getting out my books. The books are not Marion's productions, but my own, gathered from all my writings. She gathers material from my diaries, from my letters, and from the articles published in the papers. All right, so let's take a look at some of those sources. She says diaries. Okay, she used these diary books as scratch books, as she mentioned in the other note. And then, in addition to diaries, were letters. And Marion would sometimes find a sentence or two in these letters, or maybe a whole thought. Sometimes they were a gem of thought, but other times it was just a few words, not borrowed from anyone else, but Ellen White's own words. And then there were articles, as we said, that were developed from the diaries. But there were some other sources. There were the manuscripts that came from those diaries that were polished a little bit more. And then there were sometimes selections made from other books like Patriarchs and Prophets and Steps to Christ, which they had just produced. All of these were used to substitute for the basic structure of the Spirit of Prophecy. They wanted a new book on the life of Christ that would be appealing to the general public, but would also give spiritual lessons from the life of Christ. Ellen White wrote of her appreciation. Her ability to arrange the matter is of great value to me. It saves me poring over a mass of matter which I have no time to do. Ellen White was quite busy when she was in Australia. It was a brand new work. There was a lot for her to do. She was encouraging neighbors and the building of new churches. It was a remarkable work that she was doing in Australia. That brings us full circle. As D.E. Robinson described earlier, Marion would come to one of the secretaries who could type, and she would read all of these pieces that were put together, arranged together, and then she would bring that manuscript to Ellen White, and occasionally they would discover that there was a little transition that was missing. And so right on the spot, Mrs. White would supply that transition, and they would continue to go. And so the manuscript built up chapter after chapter, but not necessarily in chronological sequence. Sometimes they had to be rearranged. Sometimes there were some new chapters that weren't in the earlier book, and these would be added in little by little. The amazing thing about this process was that once that they had a finalized chapter, that would be sent to the Pacific Press, and then they would begin to set the type. But in the process, sometimes Marion would find some really, really nice phrasing that she would find in a letter or another manuscript she'd come across, and she'd want to squeeze that in there. And so she would send it over to the Pacific Press, and they'd have to stop and rework it and put it in. And on top of that, they were also illustrating this book because they really wanted it to be a top-notch quality book. And so there was the illustrator was in New York. So he would make these engravings, and they would send them to Pacific Press, and then they would put the type around them. And then if there were changes that would affect it, you couldn't just slightly reduce the image. He'd have to do a whole new image on occasion. And so it was a very complicated process, and it was weeks to send it one way or the other. And over the course of the time of preparing this manuscript, it's amazing that it was ever put together. But in the end, it was a beautiful book. The title went through several possible changes, and finally they settled on the title as The Desire of Ages, which was to be an emblematic of who Jesus was, intended not just for the Jews, but for all of the nations and all ages. Thanks for joining us. Hope you have a great day.